Good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today to share some perspectives on the role of aid, and particularly of the Norwegian aid in Africa and Mozambique in particular. Adriano Nuvunga is my name. I'm the director of CDD, Center for Democracy and Development here in Mozambique, and I'm also the chairperson of FMO, which is Mozambique Budget Group. I'm privileged to be here today. The theme of this discussion, the role of aid, and the questions that have been asked, they're indeed illuminating for a fruitful discussion today. I have a couple of points that I will share with you. And to start with, I would acknowledge that there has been a lot of debate about the role of aid, with divergent opinions about it, with some scholars and practitioners arguing that aid has helped poor countries in their efforts to alleviate poverty, while others disagree with this view and arguing that aid has undermined domestic institutions, it has increased elite corruption and the lethargy in domestic resource mobilization. Speaking from a Mozambican perspective, my view is that aid, it worked. It significantly helped a post-war devastated Mozambique early in the 90s to re-emerge institutionally with some working institutions and some basic services delivery for the impoverished population. In the war-torn Mozambique in the 90s, the state fragility was such that without aid, it would have collapsed. So it is aid that helped Mozambique preempt the state failure. And following the first democratically elected government, the aid dialogue that has played an influential role in shaping the platform for peace and democratic, and has started in the context of the debt cancellation through the heavily indebted Poor Countries Initiative, HIPIC, and the subsequent poverty reduction programs, and later the aid effectiveness debate, which started in Paris, to Accra, and later in Busan in South Korea. With all these developments, my argument here is that aid helped Mozambique survive its troubled multi-transition in the 90s to become one of Africa's example of post-war peace building and democratic transition. Mozambique's 30 years of peace and democratic experience was catalyzed by aid and the conditionalities attached to it. Yes, most of the people and people in the state service would not like the conditionalities, but the reality is that these conditionalities, they have helped to contain abuses and to keep the aid within an acceptable framework of governance. And the move from projects to sector programs and then to direct budget support was crucial, as this modality has since been more aligned with national priorities and the need for domestic institutions' voice and accountability. So the direct budget support catalyzed the good governance dialogue, particularly transparency, which was key and pivotal in catalyzing good governance in Mozambique. The transparency in the natural resource and extractive industry and public finance management and the domestic resource mobilization were in the top of Norwegian priorities. The institution building of Mozambique's gas sector has benefited enormously of Norwegian aid, cooperation, and expertise. I would also mention the people's solidarity through non-state actors and civil driven support focusing on the improvement of the livelihoods of the people, marginalized group particularly. Of course, aid figures have been in the decline, which contrasts with the exponential growth of populations and associated demands, and also the stagnation in reforms, not only in Mozambique, but in Africa generally. And with this happening, the growing extractivism in Africa, and Mozambique in particular, has changed the incentive structures of reforms. Yes, indeed. While the conditionalities were key in pushing for reforms, with the extractivism and the change, not only in the body language of the leadership, but also the view that soon they will have domestically abundant resources that would replace the bit more difficult aid due to conditionalities. That has changed the incentive for reforms. But the reality, though, is that most donor agencies have been advocating for a shift from aid to business. But the problem is, without a proper understanding of the political economies and the incentive structures underpinning that shift. What I'm saying here is that aid agencies, while they demanded democracy and some level of accountability for aid to continue the flow, the international businesses, with their billion-dollar investments, what they want is only political stability, which has made third-termism attractive in Africa and Mozambique in particular. This is not novel. President Gebuza, he tried to have a third term. He was stopped. At that time, it was still possible. And the incumbent here in Mozambique, he is also in love with the idea of a third term. Will he get it? I don't know. But the reality is that extractivism has made this, the idea of a third term attractive. And this is problematic as it goes against the gains, the democratic gains that were consolidated in Mozambique's 3-decade of aid contribution to the country. So aid, in my view, has played its role and should be, and you as Norwegians, you should be proud of your contribution to that process. It should not have been possible to push for the accountability, for instance, in the hidden debt scandal here in Mozambique without the democratic gains boosted by aid in this context. For example, Mozambique civil society organizations have engaged the Norwegian Central Bank and the Norwegian Pension Fund, calling them to divest in Credit Suisse for granting those fraudulent and non-transparent loans that led Mozambique into the brink of a collapse. It has indeed, from the supply side, failed to boost accountability. But that speaks to the factors related to the formation and the state evolution rather than to what aid can really do. And these aspects, these factors, these cleavages, these legacies of that process have not been addressed by political dynamics in the 5 decades of independence. And aid cannot be expected to fix those structural problems. Professor John Lomoy is indeed right. There is a need to set things right. But it is governance to be set right and not aid. It is governance to be set right. Let me be clear here. You cannot fix greed of the elites. You cannot fix greed of the elites. You cannot fix corruption. Aid cannot do that for you. This issues of leadership failure, and its acceptance in the wider society. It speaks to the political factors that have to do with the state formation and its evolution over time. But aid, it can help in this process through education, through healthy system, including sexual and reproductive healthy rights for girls, expertise, cooperation, combining official and society level cooperation. If that is done well, it can empower the voices within society, which are fundamental in setting governance right. If governance is right, aid, it will play a crucial role in improving the livelihood of the people. So, given the current context of extractivism, aid should, in my view, on the one hand, be focused on supporting the empowerment of democratic forces, without which there cannot be developmental and inclusive governance. And on the other hand, in a dialogue between the global south and the global north on avoiding, for instance, illicit financial flows and most of the bad governance trends that characterize the relationship between the global north and the global south. And these aspects, they are currently moving in the opposite direction to the progresses made by aid. So a collective effort is needed in order not only to address governance issues in the global south and in Mozambique in particular, but also in the relationship between the global south and the global north in setting the governance right. I would leave it here and thank you very much.